Most podcasters, if they've been doing their podcast for a little while, they're on this podcast journey and they're thinking, you know what? It would be nice if maybe we actually got paid to do this. Let's try to monetize our podcast. But do they know what they're even doing? So today I've got 7 mistakes that most podcasters make when they try to monetize a show.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You know, you can find out every single thing about that show on a website which I put together at chrisandchristineshow.com. Link to it, in the show notes of this very episode. But hey, how is your podcast coming along? Do you even have a podcast? Well, maybe you're thinking about just starting a podcast. You don't know where to start, what to talk about, all the great usual things you think about before you start a physical podcast. And one of those things is whether or not you want to spend tons and tons of money on all the crazy gear you can spend money on. Like, there's so much stuff you can buy. You could spend money on, microphones and mixers and consoles and cameras and lighting and backdrop. You can spend a fortune on podcasting gear. But before you do any of that stuff, before you even think about looking at gear to buy, you really need to figure out what you're going to talk about and who is this content for. Your why and your who. That will give you exactly a baseline of where to start when you decide to even create a podcast. Before you even break your wallet out, figure out what it's going to be about. There are some very successful podcasts that literally are using just a $70 microphone and a basic laptop, and that's all they have. And yet they're doing very well for themselves. Hey, I know podcasting is not for everybody, and doing content creation of any kind, especially audio or even video, but audio especially, it's a little nerve-wracking the first time you fire up your microphone and you talk into it, and you see it being recorded, and you listen back to your own voice. Holy crap, how many people out there have heard their own voice and are like, ew, this doesn't sound anything like me. I don't get it. Why do I sound so horrible? And they're like, I don't know. I'm just going to record it and then just ship it out without even listening back to it, because if I can't listen to it, you can listen to it, but I don't want to listen to it. But you really should listen to your own voice. You really should get used to the way your voice sounds on a physical recording. That way you can physically adjust the way it sounds, make it sound better. You can enhance it. If you can't even stand listening to your own voice, how can you even stand editing your show or even listening back to it? And if you can't stand listening to it, how can somebody else stand listening to it? But once you get your podcast up and running and you get a few episodes, under your belt, and you get the rhythm going of either weekly shows or bi-weekly shows or however you podcast, you kind of get the rhythm going and you're like, you know what? I feel pretty confident now to where possibly I need to start making some money with this whole podcasting thing, especially those who have purchased, say, a Rodecaster Pro 2 and an SM7B microphone and maybe a best Sony camera and all this lighting and all this crazy stuff. I'm talking if you've spent thousands of dollars into your podcast, you're thinking, gosh, I need to make some money back. I need to get reimbursed for all this money I spent on my podcast. I think a major problem when it comes to thinking about monetizing a podcast or making money back with your podcast is that people think that they make money from the podcast itself, as if they clocked in on a job somewhere, they punched in and they worked, even if your podcast took you 5 hours to make a single episode. So they're thinking, well, hell, I need to get paid 5 hours worth of compensation because I put 5 hours into this podcast, thinking it's like I clocked in on a job somewhere. So my boss owes me 5 hours of pay. You fill in the pay rate, say it's $20 an hour. So I deserve $100 for this episode I just did because I put 5 hours into work. Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Podcasting is like a business. So you need to think of it like a business. And like any business, you need to physically sell the business to your customers, AKA your audience. Now, whether your audience likes your episodes or does not like your episodes, they really will make the determining factor whether or not they want to spend any money with your show. Now, you don't make money directly from your podcast. You make money with your podcast. Now, what does that really mean? It means that the podcast itself, the thing you physically created, is worth nothing. Your podcast is worthless. What do you mean it's worthless? What are you talking about, Chris? I spent all this time on it. The only thing that has any value is the value that you present on the podcast, the physical content. The podcast itself is worthless. The content within the podcast really has value. It only has value to those who perceive it as value. You always kind of think like when you try to sell something, you're like, well, what is this thing worth? How much should I sell it for? And things of that sort. Well, there's ways you can really figure this out, at least for typical items, that is. Like when I had to go sell my car, I wanted to go see what other cars like it were selling for. And I kind of found a few were like very similar to mine. So I was like, well, set my pricing around the same. And that's exactly what I did. I had a few offers and a few people looking at it. And I finally sold it, for a decent price because I, put it up for sale around the same price as other cars that were selling exactly like it. Now, the true value of anything really is what any person is willing to physically pay for that said thing you're selling. Now, before I go any further today, I just want to let you know that you can podcast however you want. You do not have to make any money with your podcast. In fact, if you are enjoying your podcast, if you can physically do it week after week, month after month, year after year, for free, completely for free, not make a single dime from your podcast and enjoy it, you are in a very good position. You are in an amazing position because if you put yourself in a spot where you have to make some money or any money from your podcast to physically keep it going, you're in a world of hurt because not everybody is going to like your podcast and not everybody is going to want to buy things from you as a podcaster. So you have to be willing to accept those things. But if you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, you're golden. But if you decide to say, hey, I need to make some cash with my podcast, I want to monetize this thing. I've been doing it for a little while. Let's monetize this podcast. Today, I've got 7 mistakes that podcasters make when they try to monetize their podcast. So, kicking it off with number 1 of the top common reasons why a podcaster makes a mistake trying to monetize a podcast is their lack of diversification. You see, relying solely on one monetization method, such as maybe advertising or something like a Patreon, can limit your revenue potential. Diversifying your revenue streams through a combination of, say, advertising, listener support, merchandise sales, sponsorships, and affiliate marketing can provide a stability and maximize your earnings. Now, moving on to common pitfall number 2, that is, are you ignoring your audience preferences? You see, if you're failing to consider your audience's preferences and interests when choosing monetization strategies can lead to a disengagement and alienation. Basically meaning they want nothing to do with your podcast, so why would they buy anything from you? It's essential to strike a balance between monetization efforts and providing value, keyword here, value, to your listeners. Conduct surveys, ask them what they like, engage with your audience on social media, gather feedback to understand their preferences and tailor your monetization strategies accordingly. Because if you have no idea who your audience is, then how can you physically sell them any offers at all? Moving on to common monetization mistake number 3. This is a common one. It's probably a big one. And that is, are you overlooking the quality of your content? Maybe you are. If your show's not any good, then how can anyone listen to it And if no one's listening to it, why would they buy anything? You see, prioritizing monetization over content quality, that can harm listener retention and growth. One thing I always say when it comes to your podcast, never ever ask for anything at the very beginning of your podcast. Don't come on and say, hey, sign up for my Patreon. Hey, buy this one thing. Hey, here's my merch. Hey, sell you something. Here's a commercial, so on and so forth. While monetization should be important if you're trying to make any kind of money with your podcast, consistently delivering high quality, engaging content should remain the primary focus. You see, focus on building a loyal audience base by creating valuable, relevant content that resonates with your listeners. Give them what they need to hear before you ask for anything. Okay, moving on to the fourth way people will make a mistake when trying to monetize a podcast, and that is, are you ignoring your analytics and your data? Now, I'm not just talking about your, how many downloads did you get this week or in this episode or that episode or overall. Overall is like the worst, really. It's a big number. We all like looking at it, but it doesn't tell you what's happening episode to episode. You see, if you're neglecting to track and analyze listener data such as demographics, listening habits, and engagement metrics can hinder monetization efforts. Utilize analytic tools provided by podcast hosting platforms. The place you put your podcast at? Yeah, your podcast host. There's even third-party services out there you can do to gain insights into your audience that you may not even know. You want to optimize these monetization strategies accordingly. Data-driven decision-making can help identify lucrative opportunities and refine your approach over time. Let's just say majority of your podcast listening audience are stay-at-home moms. Now, would it be wise to possibly sell them things for stay-at-home moms versus things that might be used on a construction job site? Okay, moving on to number 5, and that is your release schedule, or should I say, if you have an inconsistent release schedule. Inconsistency in releasing new podcast episodes can impact listener engagement and hinder monetization efforts. Establish a regular publishing schedule and stick to it. Consistency builds trust with your audience and makes it easier to implement monetization strategies effectively. People will willing to do business with people that they trust. And if they can trust that every single week that you're going to release an episode and it's going to be about the same length and it's going to be about the same kind of content and it's going to sound just as good as it did last week, every single episode, it's not a big mismatch or who knows what, then they're more willing to trust you. And trust is a big key component when it comes to asking your listening audience to physically do anything, let alone spend their hard-earned money for something about your podcast. Okay, so this brings us up to common mistake number 6 when you're trying to monetize a podcast, and that is, do you have a lack of marketing and promotion for your podcast? If a tree falls in the woods and nobody even hears it around to hear it, did it even make a sound? You see, failing to effectively market and promote your podcast can limit its reach and monetization potential. Invest time and effort in promoting your podcast across various channels, including, social media, maybe even email newsletters. We do that too. Maybe do collaborations with other podcasters. And if you can, not everybody can do this, but if you could, attend industry events. I'm talking Podfest and the podcast movement, all the big podcasting events that are out there everywhere in the world. If you can increase the visibility and attract new listeners directly to your podcast, that can lead to a greater monetization opportunity through maybe advertising, sponsorships, or even listener support through like a Patreon or a Buy Me a Coffee or any of those things. You really should be working on podcast marketing. Now, when it comes to podcast marketing, that is a tricky thing. And it comes down to really how much money are you willing to invest and how much time are you willing to invest in marketing your podcast. But before you even decide to market your podcast, you need to make sure it's a good podcast in the first place. Now, last but not least, the seventh worst way to monetize a podcast is if you are you ignoring the monetization trends that are out there right now for a podcast? Are you just ignoring them? Neglecting to stay informed about emerging monetization trends and industry developments can result in missed opportunities. You should probably be aware of maybe the latest trends that are out there right now. Maybe be aware of the latest monetization strategies, maybe the new platforms that are out there, maybe new technologies that help you work on your podcast. Keep your podcast ahead of the curve in the podcasting industry. Experiment with new approaches, such as maybe just do a live event if you can. That'd be great. Or maybe you want to add, say, a premium subscription to like a Patreon or something like that, like a paywall. You can easily do those kind of things. Hey, speaking of paywalls, that's where you could probably put like exclusive content you can't get anywhere else without having to pay to get there. But before you even get to that point, you got to make sure the audience really, really loves your free stuff first before you offer them the paid stuff. Now, remember this one little key thing. If you forget anything else today, remember this one little point. And that is, on average, only 3% of your listening audience, your true people that listen, not bots, not paid audiences, not fake download numbers. I'm talking actual real people. Only 3% of the real people that listen to your show are physically going to do anything. I mean, anything at all, whether it's buy some of your merch, sign up for anything, email you, message you, or even, pay for your Patreon. Only 3%. So to put that in perspective, let's just say you have an audience of 100 people, which I think that's a decent sized audience. 100 dedicated listeners that come to your show every single episode, 100 of them. And of those 100, you will be lucky to get 3 of them to physically do anything. So think about that before you say, I'm going to start a Patreon, or I'm going to start all this stuff, or sell this merch, or sell all this nonsense. If only 3% actually show up. Now, that's if you have 100 people that listen. Hey, I get it. I know it can be very frustrating if you have maybe 20 to 50 regular downloads and you think, well, 3% of that is hardly anything. It actually comes out to about 1, or actually less than 1. So you are hoping to make less than 1 to actually do anything with your podcast. And I'm sorry to be the one to burst your bubble. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that there is a very, very slim chance you're going to make any kind of money directly off of, say, ads or sponsors or anything like that, or even buying merch. There's a very, very slim chance you're going to make a fortune based on a very small audience. So what you really got to do, work on creating an amazing show, a show that they cannot get anywhere else possible. Look at your show and think about it from the name of the show, the artwork of the show, the concept of the show, the actual content itself of the show. Look at all of that, step back and think, like, where am I falling short? Where can I fix some things here to draw in more listeners to the podcast? And I'm not talking about just dumping money on more marketing. You know what? You can spend millions of dollars on marketing a turd. Guess what? It's still a piece of crap. But don't you worry. Hey, don't give up hope. Hey, don't go anywhere. Just hang on a minute. Hey, there's still potential. There's still hope. Podcasting is not oversaturated like YouTube is. Oh my goodness, there's so many YouTube channels. So if you want to be in the YouTube playing the YouTube pool, you are going to be like a drop in the ocean compared to all the YouTubers out there. Podcasting is probably only maybe somewhere around 400,000 active podcasts that have made an episode within the last 90 days. Now, there's been millions of YouTubers out there and millions of shows that have been made in the last minute, it seems like. So your chance of being discovered on an audio podcast is much higher than, say, in a YouTube thing. Now, with YouTube, like I said before, YouTube owns the whole playground. You're playing at their house. They make the rules. They pay you how they want. It's their house. You're just living in it and working in it. And you're also going up against so many other content creators in the YouTube space. It's harder to break through with YouTube than it is probably an audio podcast. Audio podcasting, there's more potential. There's a wider reach. There's more platforms people can listen to them on. There is just so many positive things with an audio podcast that probably trumps over a YouTube channel. And I'm not saying YouTube's bad, I'm not bashing on YouTube. I've been doing YouTube for years and years. It's fine, it's fun. But if you're truly thinking about making some serious money with your content, with your show, why don't you make the rules? Why don't you set the bar? Why don't you be the one in charge of your own destiny rather waiting on somebody else or some other platform like a YouTube to do it for you? Take control, be your own boss, and take charge of your own show. Hey, once again, I want to say thank you so much for being here today. I really do appreciate you listening today all the way through to the end. And if you found any value from this episode, perhaps maybe you learned what not to do when it came to monetizing your podcast. Hey, could you do me a small favor? Could you hit that follow button or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to the show on right now? Whether you're on YouTube, hit subscribe. Whether you're on Apple, hit follow. Wherever you are, if you could hit follow, you will never, ever, ever miss a future episode. And that is where you will find me on the next one. Until then, happy podcasting.